I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere among the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate, those that I guard I do not love. Nor law nor duty bade me fight, not public men, not cheering crowds. A lonely impulse of delight drove to this tumult in the clouds. I balanced all, brought all to mind. The years to come seemed waste of breath, a waste of breath the years behind, in balance with this life, this death.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History. That was W.B. Yeats reading his famous First World War poem, An Irish Airman Foresees His Death, and I choke up every time I hear that. It must be the most moving words ever written about First World War aviation, and it's a great lead into today's topic because we're going to be talking to Michael Molkentin about those First World War aviators, the pioneers who flew in these flimsy machines and then came home to found airlines and become commercial pilots and really lay the basis for modern aviation. So we'll be hearing from Michael in just a few moments. Thank you to everyone who responded, the huge response to last week's podcast where Peter Hart was talking about the interviews he's done with World War I and World War II veterans. It's a tragedy to think that before we know it, the last World War II veteran will be gone. We've already lost the First World War veterans and the Second World War veterans. We're losing at an alarming rate. So it's wonderful that people like Peter are keeping their memory alive and keeping that history alive with the work that they've done over the decades, recording the stories of veterans. If you enjoyed that podcast and you're enjoying the podcast in general, please subscribe. Tell your friends about it. Our audience is growing every week, and the more people that listen, the more people that subscribe, the more fantastic content we can bring you. So please tell your friends about it, subscribe, and review us on iTunes. Let's get on with this week's episode. Let's hear from Michael Molkentin about the aviation pioneers. I'm Matt McLaughlin. This is Living History.
A date which will live in infamy.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Well, may we say, God save the Queen, because nothing will save the Governor General.
There's a second plane just crashed into the World Trade Center. I think we have a terrorist attack.
This was their finest hour.
Michael, it's fantastic to have you on the show. Why don't we begin by you taking us back in time? Let's go back to the late 1800s. What was the state of aviation at this time? I mean, I get the impression that people knew that human flight was possible. It was just a question of them working out exactly how it was going to occur. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, Matt. Most people will probably be familiar with, the famous date, 1903, December 1903, when the American Wright brothers first flew in Kitty Hawk. But aviation has a much longer prehistory, obviously. I mean, depending on who you read, sometimes these accounts go all the way back to the ancient Chinese who, we think were flying balloons, unmanned, of course, but they were flying balloons up using hot air, maybe as far back as AD 200 or something like that. But in terms of manned flight, really aviation, comes about, I think, as one of the many impacts of the scientific and industrial revolutions that happened in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So this is really the beginning of it. Science, industry, and as you kind of alluded there. A lot of the things we take for granted today, when we look at aircraft and we say, that's an airplane, most aircraft have a lot of very similar features. These days they've got wings, they've got ailerons, all of those sort of design components. Well, in the 1800s when, flight was being worked out, those things needed to be designed from scratch, and there was no given, there was no one option. There were many different ways that, of course, people could imagine, aircraft being designed and aircraft taking flight.
Well, we've all seen that old footage of the, almost like the Birdman rallies with these hilarious contraptions that people are strapping on. And you're so right. I think we take it for granted now that that's an aircraft. That's what it looks like. But as you say, back in the day when they were trying to invent them, there was all sorts of weird and wonderful designs that were coming out, and no one really had an idea about what was going to work effectively, did they?
No, that's right. And also, it's interesting, we obviously, powered aircraft are obviously the thing that we focus on now because that's what makes up the majority of air travel and military aviation today. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there was definitely a lot of question about whether powered heavier than air aircraft would be sort of the way of the future, or whether it would be actually balloons and dirigible balloons, so balloons that could be steered, what we might sort of think these days as a blimp. So both technologies were developing concurrently. During certainly balloons throughout the 19th century, and then aircraft in the early 20th century as well. And there were advocates for both. I mean, in terms of, probably the most famous example for the dirigible airships was were the Germans with their Zeppelins prior to the First World War. They were world famous, and they were very, technically very impressive for the time. They were able to essentially do trans-continental flight, even before the First World War, and that certainly spurred a lot of aviation development in neighbouring countries, especially as the prospect of aerial bombardment became a reality with. For countries like Britain, who had been protected by the ocean, but all of a sudden faced this, potential threat from the skies with the emergence of this new technology.
And it all happened fairly quickly, didn't it? It seems that when you look back through the history, that in very quick bounds, people were discovering what was possible with manned flight, and they're making very quick technological advances at this stage, weren't they?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, you're right. I mean, balloons first emerged in terms of balloons that could carry humans. 1780s in France were the first balloon flights, and they, over the next sort of 100 or so years, the technology didn't change dramatically, that is for balloons. In terms of aircraft, again, there's a lot of experimentation done, especially during the later decades of the 19th century. But once we get to the 20th century, and it seems like with the Wrights and with some others, particularly some of the French inventors, like Blériot would be a fairly prominent one. Once they kind of unlock, I guess, what you could almost describe as the magic formula, once they have engines that can generate enough horsepower, with their power to weight ratio, things certainly do develop quite quickly. From the Wright's first flight in 1903, it's only just over a decade to the beginning of the First World War, and all the belligerent armies in Europe take nascent air services to war in 1914, and then of course the war gives things a really, really big kick along in terms of the development of both, not just the technology of aviation, but also what I guess historians now describe as air-mindedness. So this kind of this acceptance of this embracing of aviation and air travel, and I think the First World War plays a really, really big role in that as well.
What was the situation with aviation in Australia? Because I feel that our isolation, it was a very long sea voyage to get to Australia. Australia had a real incentive to find ways of connecting in a more effective way with the rest of the world, didn't we? So what was the situation in Australia in those very early days when this debate was going on between balloons and powered aircraft? What was happening in Australia?
The first balloons came to Australia in the 1850s, and they were brought here by essentially travelling showmen. And these were individuals, usually, in hindsight, fairly eccentric individuals who would get their hands on balloons, and they'd essentially tour them around the world. And balloons were a spectacle. They were a very modern spectacle at the time, and the first balloons come to Australia essentially as travelling shows, and they fly in public places. The idea was that you bought a ticket, you came along and saw them. A little bit later on, the owners of these balloons are selling space on the balloons for advertisement, so you could have your company's brand name, emblazoned on the balloon or flying off a banner on the balloon. And so they're essentially this commercial kind of undertaking initially. And those early balloon flights in the mid-1800s in Australia, they draw tens of thousands of people. There's balloon flights in the Domain in Sydney, as well as Cremorne Gardens down in Melbourne. And yeah, like I say, they draw tens of thousands of people, and it's really quite remarkable. In one instance as well, there's in a couple of instances actually, they even cause riots because people turn up to see these things, and certainly there was a case in the late 1850s in Sydney in the Domain where the balloon basically failed. And I mean, at this stage, they're not using even hydrogen. The balloons are being essentially powered by hot air. They're burning hay over a brazier and, trying to heat the air up so the balloon inflates. And there was actually a riot where the balloon didn't work and the crowd wrecked the place essentially, set the balloon on fire and caused some big issues. But, I mean, that's sort of the early history of aviation in Australia. After the Wrights first flew in 1903, aviation again comes to Australia prominently through aircraft that are imported or toured from overseas. There wasn't really that much of a native aviation industry. Certainly there were some individuals who were contributing to the global development of aviation understanding. Lawrence Hargraves would probably be the one that's familiar to most, the individual who's familiar to most people. But yeah, during sort of between 1903 and the start of the First World War, there are a number of aircraft that are imported, usually by fairly wealthy individuals into the country. Sometimes they're brought here by companies that are touring their wares around and looking to sell airplanes, particularly to governments to be part of their military. And again, these draw big crowds. Thousands of people turn up, and there isn't airports at this stage. There isn't aerodromes. Typically, they're running them off racetracks and things like that. And when before the First World War in Australia, when an airplane turned up, when it came to town, it was something that everyone went and saw. It's a modern spectacle to see a human being fly. Was something that you'd maybe read about in the newspapers, but certainly not something that many people thought they would see. I mean, we need to remember that this time cars are comparatively rare on Australian roads. So seeing a flying machine was certainly quite a spectacle for these people.
I absolutely love that element of this history, the idea that someone going up in a hot air balloon or an early aircraft was drawing tens of thousands of people for the spectacle. Because you said it before, we take this technology for granted. We've all grown up with aircraft. It's just something that we do. But imagining less than 100 years ago, or only about 100 years ago, we're talking now about people drawing a crowd every time a man got off the ground. It's absolutely fascinating. But there was also, I think there was also a certain mystique about the technology too, wasn't there? I think when you have this new technology, there are also elements about it that were a little bit unsavory, that there was lots of rumors, there was also a bit of a scary element about the idea that man could fly, wasn't there?
Yeah, it's really interesting. When we look back at sort of how people and how, society thought about and felt about aviation at the turn of the century, I think what we can see is two things. On the one hand, and these two things I think in some respects are contradictory. There's definitely a tension there. On the one hand, I think people see aviation as this, the pinnacle of European civilization and progress. It's this inherently modern scientific spectacle that represents, humankind, but as they would say, man conquering the elements, going into a frontier that they hadn't explored before. And that tied in with, of course, exploration at that time. It tied in with other advances in, other fields of science. And I guess it reflected that sort of optimism that Europeans felt about themselves in the lead up to 1914, that, of course, afterwards was shattered. On the other hand, however, there was this kind of undercurrent of concern about what, and this again taps into a wider undercurrent of concern about how industrialization was affecting European society. I mean, for all the benefits of industrialization, of course, it had also created these crowded urban cities that some commentators believed were, degenerating the Europeans as a race of people and all this kind of stuff. In terms of aircraft, this manifests itself, I suppose, in a lot of speculative commentary on how aircraft might shape future wars. And at the forefront of this is science fiction writers like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. In 1908, H.G. Wells wrote a really famous story called The War in the Air that basically envisaged this aerial fleet flying across the Atlantic and devastating New York. And alongside the science fiction, you've got non-fiction, but speculative non-fiction. So you've got commentators, you've got thinkers, you've got philosophers, you've got journalists writing about how they think aviation will shape future conflicts. And there's this belief that perhaps air power will become so destructive that wars will be able to be won or lost in an afternoon because an air fleet will simply go across and decimate the enemy's capital city. And there was a real concern about this, and it is, as I say, reflected in the literature and the journalism at the time.
I suppose it was an era as well where the late 1800s there was a lot of spiritualism. There was a lot of the Victorian era where there was a lot of a connection with spiritualism and a lot of things we would think of as a bit of sort of strange science these days. And then also this birth of this technology, which is fairly modern in its approach. It was the earliest days of it, but it's technology that would go on for the next century. So I can understand that there was a bit of a clash of cultures there in some ways between the people who thought this was a great leap forward, but also the people that were a bit concerned about what it would lead to.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you mentioned of the spiritualism and sort of these pseudo-sciences at the time. There's an element of that in aviation too. I mean, the first aviators in Europe and indeed in Australia, they are not university-trained, engineers and scientists. They are gentlemen hobbyists. I mean, in the early 1900s in France or Britain, if you wanted to learn to fly, you bought an aeroplane and you assembled it, or had your men assemble it. And then you basically learn, you self-taught you taught yourself how to fly it. And in many cases you killed yourself or severely injured yourself or others in the process. But it was very much the age of the amateur. Aviation, I think it's through the First World War that it becomes much more scientific, much more professionalized, much more expert. But yeah, certainly in its early days, it's the preserve of amateurs and enthusiastic amateurs and novices.
Well, when did we get serious about it? When did we move from this era of the enthusiastic amateur to a serious effort to take advantage of the new flying technology?
Aviation is a global phenomenon, and so the story is complex because at any point in time where you're looking at what's going on in one, part of the world, Australia, for example, there's a whole context and a whole story that's happening elsewhere. And, these aviators in various countries in these events, these sort of famous flights and, these early pioneering events, they do resonate around the world through the press and through, professional associations and things like that. If I was going to pick a year, though, or sort of a moment in time, I would say probably in a global sense, but also in Australia, 1909 would be really the year that aviation goes from being something very experimental and provincial to essentially establishing itself as a reasonably serious activity and something that has real prospects for the future. On a global scale in 1909, you've got a number of armies, including the biggest armies in Europe, like the Germans and the French. They're starting to use aircraft on military exercises for reconnaissance purposes, and they're having success doing so. There's an air show in Reims in France that attracts 500,000 people, and literally dozens and dozens of aircraft turn up to this. And remember, this is only 6 years after the Wrights had first flown in the US. So, I mean, this has happened extraordinarily quickly, and these are aircraft that are flying this 10-kilometre course. They're doing, they're viable aircraft. They're actually doing what they're supposed to do. And back home in Australia in 1909 as well, yeah, there's a number of things that go on. There's an association called the Aerial League of Australia that's formed early in 1909, and it's essentially an offshoot of a league that had been formed in London. And the league's purpose, it sort of sees itself as kind of this lobby group or this advocacy group for aviation in general. But what it wants to do is promote aviation in society, but also put pressure on governments to develop aviation defences. And this is a very novel thing at the time, but there is a lot of discussion, as I mentioned before, about the role of aeroplanes in war. And the League actually in Australia in 1909 manages to convince the Australian government to hold a competition to design an aircraft for military purposes. So the government offers a £5,000 prize and essentially puts a tender out and says, design, Australian designed, Australian built aircraft for military purposes. The government will pay you, we'll put it into production, and that will be the basis of our flying service. So I would say, 1909 is really the tipping point for aviation when it becomes a reality both globally and in Australia.
Well, you're certainly right when you say that it happened astonishingly quickly, because I think anyone who's been to see the Wright Flyer, that original aircraft that flew in Kitty Hawk in 1903, which is now in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., anyone that looks at that aircraft, I mean, it's basically a kite with an engine strapped onto it. It's paper thin. I mean, I think it's made out of canvas and timber. It is so insubstantial. And to think that, but that was the plane that started it all. That was the first powered flight. But to think that only 6 years later, I just can't believe how quickly this technology advanced. In 6 years, we had air shows that were drawing 500,000 people. We had aircraft that could fly, effectively across water. They could bridge the English Channel. They could fly, dozens of kilometres. It was just such an incredible burst of technology that really captured aviation. But as you said, the big turning point, the big thing that really advanced the technology of flight was the First World War, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as I mentioned before, all the armies of Europe go to war in 1914 with flying services equipped both with balloons for observation, but also aircraft as well. These air services, of course, all had their own, idiosyncrasies in the ways in which, they would be integrated into the forces that took them to war. But taking the British Army as an example, its Royal Flying Corps, it goes to war with it takes 4 squadrons to the Western Front in 1914. So we're talking really, less than 30 aircraft effectively, on strength. It's a very small flying corps. But for the size of the British Army at the time, it was actually the largest flying service in Europe, relative to the size of the army that it would be supporting. In the British Army's eyes, it was taking these aircraft to war not to devastate cities like H.G. Wells and others had speculated, but really they were going to be an adjunct to the cavalry. So the idea was the aircraft would be scouts. They would fly out, they would map the enemy's dispositions, and they'd bring intelligence back to battlefield commanders to help them make the decisions and issue orders. And that's certainly the role they play. I would argue that during that first sort of chaotic 3 or 4 months of the First World War, during the German invasion of Belgium and France, that aircraft play a really important role, and they have a decisive impact on how those campaigns play out. And I would even argue that aircraft contribute to the stalemate forming, the trench warfare stalemate, because one of the keys traditionally in warfare to bring about decision in battle is to surprise your enemy, to do something that they won't expect and that they won't be able to counter. Well, aircraft remove that possibility. They are feeding information for both, and it goes both ways. So the Germans more or less know constantly what the British and the French are doing, and vice versa. And I think this contributes to the stalemate forming. From there, though, after 1914, once the trenches do form and consolidate across Belgium and France, aircraft begin to take on different roles. So reconnaissance obviously remains an absolutely key role for all air services throughout the war, though it becomes more sophisticated with cameras replacing the naked eye a pencil and notepad as the means of gathering reconnaissance. But also during 1915, during the first real year of trench warfare, a whole other range of air power roles emerge. And indeed, these are the roles that to this very day form the basis of what air services do. So we're talking about things like bombing, both tactical bombing on the battlefield, but also bombing, strategic bombing, so bombing cities, bombing industry, bombing economies. We got close air support, artillery cooperation. So this becomes, particularly for the Royal Flying Corps with the British Army, one of their core roles is directing the fire of the artillery. Artillery is firing at targets they can't see with the naked eye, but the aircraft provide the targeting data that they need. Even some early forms of battlefield resupply. By 1918, aircraft are dropping ammunition and supplies by parachute on the battlefield. So these roles developed, really, really quite quickly during the war. And the technology developed, but also the thinking about air power developed. And in the space of 4 years, we go essentially from having aircraft as I say, adjuncts, as in, something that's sort of there to support the existing arms, to an arm that can really wage war in its own right. And that's probably best demonstrated by the fact that in 1918, the Royal Air Force is formed as an independent third service, and that's the first time any country has done that in the world.
I love this assessment of what was happening during the First World War, Michael, because I think we often do a disservice to the men and women who served in the First World War by constantly thinking of it as this stale, old-fashioned war. We think of it as all generals in chateaus sending men out with old tactics to march against machine guns. But when you look at it closely, you realise that there were huge technological advances being made during this war that everyone had to deal with. And I think in many ways, there were a lot more technological advances that took place in the First World War than occurred even in the Second World War, for example. In the First World War, we saw basically these very basic aircraft that people didn't even know how to use in 1914. And then in 4 short years, we had, as you say, huge dogfights, aerial attack, bombardment, the things that we associate with modern aircraft. So that leap in technology in the First World War was absolutely extraordinary, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you just mentioned dogfights. I mean, there's accounts in 1918 of up to 80, 90 aircraft involved in dogfights over the Western Front. Well, that's more aircraft than the Royal Flying Corps actually took to war in 1914, engaged in one battle. So it certainly it expanded in size remarkably. I mentioned the British Army took 4 squadrons to war in 1914. When the armistice happened, they had 99 squadrons on the Western Front alone, and they were also heavily committed in the Middle East, Africa, had an enormous training organisation in Canada, and many other places around the globe as well, with commitments and infrastructure and things in place. The speed at which aviation develops in the First World War is really unlike anything that we would see for the rest of the 20th century in terms of the speed at which aircraft are developed, sea service, and then are retired. During the 4 years of the First World War, for example, there's 5 generations of fighter aircraft that we can really sort of group the various fighters into. Some of these aircraft are hitting the drawing board, going into production, going into service, and then being superseded and replaced within the space of 2.5 years. And in comparison with that, the 747, which of course is, the mainstay of many airlines, until very recently, that's been in service for 50 years. A single aircraft. Now, of course, the sophistication of the 747 is considerably more than a First World War aeroplane, but nonetheless, I think the point is that the change just happened so quickly. And your point about the First World War not being some stale, old, static conflict where, these blundering, generals and politicians, just sort of fought it out for 4 years using the same old tactics and equipment. I think the introduction of aviation revolutionised warfare. It completely changed warfare. And it's one of the things that, I guess, distinguishes war in the 19th century from and before and the 20th century.
And what was it like for these blokes getting into these flimsy machines and going up and fighting in these dogfights and these big duels against the enemy? Because it must have been absolutely horrific being basically up there in nothing but a canvas and timber plane, with bullets tearing through the fuselage. Must have been an absolutely horrific experience.
Yeah, look, it was dangerous. I should say the first thing, it was dangerous. The casualty rates were very high, and they weren't just high for combat; they were high for training. I mean, looking at again the Australian Flying Corps as an example, just over half the number of Australian Flying Corps men who were killed in action or killed during the First World War died in training accidents. So, even learning to fly these things was inherently dangerous. The combat itself, of course, it was a frightening, stressful, horrendous experience. The aircraft had no protection. They were made of timber and linen fabric, and essentially high tension wires. And so, pilots were exposed to enemy bullets. The fuel tanks were unprotected, and of course the aircraft are made of highly flammable materials. So, catching fire was a particular horror that a lot of airmen feared. And even putting aside the enemy aircraft and anti-aircraft guns, it's just the elements. I mean, these were open. All of the aircraft in the First World War were open cockpit machines. Most, with a few exceptions, late in the war, pilots didn't have oxygen, and flying at altitudes above 10,000 feet, they were exposed to the effects of hypoxia, freezing temperatures. The engine, which sat, less than a foot in front of their face, emitted an enormous amount of noise. A lot of these guys had hearing damage after the war as a result of this. Physically very, very demanding enterprise to take to the skies in the First World War. And that's actually demonstrated, I think, quite neatly in some of the statistics, for the Australian squadrons as just a case study. And this is certainly true of the broader British forces flying during the First World War. These pilots, on average, you wouldn't expect them to have a service life of more than a year. And that's even if they survive that time. Afterwards, in most cases, they'd be sent home to be instructors, because it was just realised that the physical and the mental stresses of service flying just couldn't be endured any longer.
Well, they didn't even wear parachutes, did they, in these aircraft? So bailing out, like we imagined the Second World War, was not really an option in the First World War.
Yeah, that's right. And there's a lot of controversy and debate about this. There were prejudices against parachutes in the British flying service, because I guess there was the belief was more or less that pilots might be tempted to abandon an aircraft that could otherwise be saved. But that wasn't the whole story. I mean, this is early days for aviation technology in all respects, including parachutes. And there wasn't, especially in the first half of the war, there wasn't a parachute that would be practical to equip to these aircraft. These aircraft, especially the fighters, are very, very small. That said, balloon observers did have parachutes and did use them. And towards the end of the First World War, the Germans began equipping their airmen with parachutes. But again, they were very primitive designs, and there's a number of documented cases where German airmen bailed out, and the chutes didn't open, and they ended up being killed as a result of that.
Really incredible stories, aren't they? I mean, it's just such a courageous time. And these were the men who then came back to Australia, and not just the Australians, of course, but went back to civilian life all over the world. And in many cases founded airlines and were really the pioneers of this the golden age of flying that we saw between the wars, weren't they?
Yeah, so I think there's three groups as I kind of understand it. There's the men who, after the First World War, they go home and as in pilots and mechanics and other technicians who'd worked with the aircraft, they go home and then they go back to their bank or their teaching classroom or their bakery or their whatever their trade or job was, and they never really have anything to do with aviation again. And there are a number of them, and I find them an interesting group in themselves, that they sort of had this extraordinary diversion to their life for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and then they just come back to it. And there's certainly cases there. For those who wanted to continue flying after the war, there were I think 2 different options that they had. The first one was to pursue a military career. There were air forces springing up all over the world in the 1920s. the Royal Australian Air Force was formed in 1921. As I've already mentioned, the Royal Air Force in Britain was formed in the last year of the First World War. But these tended to be in the context of the 1920s with defence spending cuts, and in the context of the League of Nations, and the hope that the First World War had been the war to end all wars. Air forces were pretty small. I mean, the Royal Australian Air Force begins with 21 officers. So obviously, for the several hundred Australians who had war flying experience, the competition to get into that was pretty strong. And so the air forces really around the world, none of them really become big enough to completely take advantage of the number of men who'd learned to fly and had war flying experience. So that left the other option, and that was into civilian aviation. And this essentially doesn't exist at the end of the First World War. There were no airlines at the end of the First World War. There were very few private companies in the world that were offering air services such as airmail or passenger transport. That changes remarkably quickly. All over the world, this surplus of war aircraft. Aircraft are very cheap to get after the war. There's thousands of aircraft available that could be easily converted to carry, say, mail rather than bombs. And of course, there's all these unemployed airmen kicking around. And so you get, as the 1920s begins, you get these air services spring up around the world. And this is particularly important for Australia because we are not only geographically isolated from the rest of the British Empire, which, of course, in that day and age is the centre of our universe, but also our population centres around the continent are quite dispersed. And so for a lot of these sort of early pioneers in the civil aviation realm in Australia, it seems that aviation is going to offer a bit of a solution to a geographic problem that Australia has historically faced.
And was that the case? Did aviation at that time bridge the gap between the cities in Australia?
Yeah, look, I think in a word, yes. Aviation does take off, so to speak, in Australia during the 1920s, civil aviation that is, and it becomes a very useful form of transport. That said, there are a number of problems that I guess stymie the development of a civil aviation industry in Australia during the 1920s. And as a result of that, it really does take, I think, the 2 decades during the 20s and 30s for aviation to become well established in Australia, or at least established to the point where it's a viable industry. But even then, it remains a challenging thing to have on the relatively small scale that Australia's population offers to have aviation as a viable sort of business.
Probably the most famous example in amongst all of this is Qantas, isn't it? Which was formed effectively off the back of First World War airmen and obviously became our national carrier.
Yeah, so Qantas is formed in 1921 by a couple of Australian Flying Corps airmen, Hudson Fish and Paul McGuinness. They'd actually flown together in the Middle East. And it begins as, in a sense, it begins as a fairly typical air service. It's in rural Queensland, based out of Longreach, and it's doing a bit of everything. It's carrying mail, it's transporting station owners and others around rural Queensland. Initially, they're using surplus war aircraft that can only carry a single passenger. But from there, they start to develop and they grow and they establish regular air routes to other parts of Queensland, to Brisbane before the end of the 1920s. But we need to remember that alongside Qantas during the 20s, there are a number of other carriers around the country. By I think 1928, there's 6 or 7 different scheduled services in Australia. That means daily or weekly flights to carry passengers between point A and point B. But I suppose Qantas becomes different. Qantas is unique in that in the 1930s they team up with British Empire Airways to become Qantas Empire Airways, and they become international. And in 1935, Qantas begins flying to Singapore, and the idea is that they will link up on link up to an Empire air route that goes all the way from Britain to Singapore, and there basically they get the contract to cover that last step from Singapore into Australia. And it's from there that, of course, Australia is linked with the rest of the world by aviation. There had been a number of record-breaking flights in the 1920s and 30s. Ross Smith and Charles Kingston Smith, who I mentioned before, Bert Hinkler and others, who'd done these long-distance flights. But it really is in the mid-30s when Qantas begins regular passenger services that international aviation becomes something that is a practical reality for everyday people in Australia.
Well, Michael, it's just such a fascinating topic. I mean, we could go on and on about this because we're now leading into this new period, the 1930s leading up to the Second World War. The story of aviation just obviously keeps growing and is just so fascinating that I think we'll get you on again for a second podcast to look at more recent developments in it. But thank you so much for your time. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Thanks, Matt. It's always good to talk to you.